Hello and welcome everybody to this live stream. I hope you're sitting comfortably and you've had a good day wherever you are, whatever the time. Today it's my great pleasure to be discussing That Hideous Strength by C.S. Lewis. Many of us will know Lewis primarily for the Chronicles of Narnia, perhaps also for his more philosophical, theological writings, such as Mere Christianity or Surprised by Joy. But he also wrote these science fiction novels, and we're going to be looking at one of them today, which, having reread it a couple of times recently, is very relevant to our current moment in so many ways. It could have been written yesterday and you would believe it was. But I'm not alone to discuss it. Today I'm very delighted to have a couple of guests with me, perhaps some more joining later, a bit like St. Anne's Manor that we'll come to later. So first but not least, we have here Apostolic Majesty. Hello, AM. How are you doing?
I'm doing fine, thank you. Thank you for having me, and nice to appear back on your channel.
It's great to have you back. And many of the folks watching this channel will know you from the Tolkien series. But I just wondered, have you read much C.S. Lewis before? Is this your first time, or given your interest in Tolkien?
Well, interestingly, I sort of wrote off C.S. Lewis for a while. I mean, obviously, I read the Narnia books. I read this Ransom trilogy, which Hideous Strength was the third book, a while ago. But other than reading a couple of essays, my sort of understanding, albeit sort of limited understanding of Tolkien, I would say was always greater. But I think this has helped actually rekindle a lot of interest back into C.S. Lewis. In particular, I found reading this quite fascinating because obviously recently gone over Tolkien books such as The Lost Road and the Notion Club Papers. And of course, from a place and time historically, this is the C.S. Lewis counterpart to that story. In particular, I found rereading That Hideous Strength, all the interesting pre-Lord of the Rings references to Numenor were quite interesting.
Yeah, it's a fascinating little kind of nugget for all the Tolkien nerds out there. But yes, and we're also, it's a great pleasure to welcome Amy to the channel. Hello, Amy.
Hi, thanks for having me on.
Oh, not at all. Thanks for coming. Most people will know you from Women's Hour on the Academic Agent, but you also have your own channel. That's right.
Yeah, a very small channel that I haven't done anything on in a couple of months, but I'm working on a video that should be up sometime soon, hopefully.
Mm-hmm. And what's your engagement with C.S. Lewis been before reading That Hideous Strength?
Well, when I was growing up, I was obsessed with the Narnia books, specifically The Horse and His Boy and the Silver Chair, and I used to have them all on audiobook, and I would listen to those two every night when I was falling asleep. And I've loved them. I've reread them so many times as an adult, and it was maybe about a year ago, and I started to read more of Lewis's apologetics and his essays. I think I was quite like a lot of people are, where you've heard of the Lion, the Witch, and the Wardrobe and the Narnia books until quite recently, and I hadn't read any of the Cosmic trilogy until a few weeks ago when you contacted me. So it's lovely.
Super. And we're also delighted to be joined by Radical Liberation. Hello, sir.
Howdy, rushing in from doing lots of stuff this morning, but I'm here.
You're here. That's the main thing. And you were telling me that some of your family have been reading this book as well.
Right. I think what made you think to invite me is that I'd been sharing some passages, and you wrongly presumed that I was reading along with my daughter because I was sharing these. Mm-hmm. My 16-year-old was reading these. This is the painter that some of you who follow me on Twitter see her paintings. She was reading That Hideous Strength, finishing up the trilogy, and part of the reason I'm here is because she urged me to do this so that I would reread the book, and be able to talk to her about it. So she's looking forward to this stream and just the fact that I got through the book. But may I mention my own C.S. Lewis
Go for
stuff real quick? Okay, well, yeah. I guess a headline point to make it clear my connection to Lewis and to this trilogy in particular is that our fourth child, am I getting that right? Yeah, our fourth child, second son, is named Ransom. And he is named Ransom, in fact, in honor of Elwyn Ransom. And it's a little unusual for a first name, but it's not unheard of, actually. There are people named Ransom in the world. Not a lot. And we added one. So there you go. In regards, and I could say many other things about Lewis and his influence on me. And part of the problem, AM, is that I read Lewis and Tolkien very much at the same time. And so sometimes, especially when it comes to their thoughts on writing and some other things, I actually mix them up a lot. Sort of their nonfiction is all sort of swirled together in my brain. But anyway, so I read a lot of Tolkien and Lewis when I was young, and would read over these things over and over again. The nonfiction, the apologetics, played a bit of a role in my 16-year-old daughter becoming a Christian, for example, but also another friend or two who were atheists. And I at certain key points in our ongoing conversation, I would hand them Mere Christianity, and in at least one, maybe two cases, that like flipped the switch. You know, like we were talking, talking, and then I hand them Mere Christianity, and they're like, I got it, I'm there now. You know, so you know, I'm grateful to Mr. Lewis for his influence through his apologetics on dear friends of mine who ended up converting to Christianity as adults, in part through his influence. So yeah, there's all that. And then I wanted to say something about that hideous strength, my relationship to that hideous strength in particular, which is I was a voracious reader when I was young. I would like to be a voracious reader now. I'm just too busy. But I read a book every day or two when I was like a teenager, you know, and into my 20s and stuff. So I read not fast, but I spent a lot of time doing it. And I had a general thing where I would sort of finish things I started, even if I wasn't that into them. So, for example, I read War and Peace, and I actually didn't enjoy it. For whatever reason, I'm a big Russianophile, and some of my favorite authors are Russian. I studied Russian. But for whatever reason, War and Peace just didn't click with me at the time. Maybe I'd enjoy it if I read it now. But I just made myself read it. I mean, this massive book. I just was like, okay, I started, I'm going to finish it. You know, I just plowed through it. That hideous strength defeated me the first time I tried it. Now, I was probably 13 in my defense. But as he explains in the preface, it starts out rather pedestrian, right? And you're literally sitting in on college academic administrative meetings or something, right? I mean, it verges on dull for a couple chapters, or it could easily be dull. So I made it about, I think, 50 pages the first time I tried. And I didn't get to the part where it starts to tick over into the more sort of obviously fairy tale aspects, right? He's setting up the setting, the modern setting and the college setting and everything in this weird institute. And it doesn't seem that exciting and magical, and Merlin's not there, and right, all that. And so I made it 50 pages and I gave up, which is very, very unusual for me.
Radical.
And then Go ahead.
There's one thing in particular, because I was reading this for the first time in a while, and I didn't really care for it the first time. But rereading this, I found there was a turning point where I think it was Mark was at a meeting of NICE, and all of a sudden, I can't remember who was speaking, begins talking about interplanetary phenomena and other worlds, and all of a sudden it's like this boring sort of political feuding between the reactionary and progressive wings of Bracton, and then all of a sudden they're talking about interdimensional sort of forces.
It's like, whoa,
interplanetary forces. It's quite a turn up all of a sudden.
Exactly.
Just as a matter of fact as well, isn't it? It's just like, oh, and there's interplanetary communication going on.
Right. Yeah, I know. They just drop it like it's casual. So just to finish that story, I stopped after 50 pages, and I actually set it aside for years. I didn't come back to it for 2 or 3 years or something. I don't remember, until I was 16 or I don't know, something like that. And then when I finally read it, I thought it was one of the best novels I'd ever read, and it just had a huge impact on me. Oh, sorry, one more thing. Sorry, all this introductory stuff. One more thing. So I sometimes mention a fellow named Ralph Rako. He passed away. It's been a while now, but he was a historian, a friend of Murray Rothbard's, really good on a number of issues. His writing on the Bieno, I'm not going to say the words right, AM, Bieno Rosso. He explains about that and why that brought about Mises to say some happy thing, praise towards the early fascists. Anyway, Reiko was a great historian, very interesting person, and someone I enjoyed personally. I knew him fairly well, and he told me, I don't know if he's ever mentioned it to anyone else. He told me that he would read That Hideous Strength every other year, which I found particularly striking because he was a bit of a, I don't know, ex-Christian or something like that. He was not a believer, but he said he read That Hideous Strength every other year. He thought it was so important of a book. And that has influenced me also in wanting to be part of this conversation and wanting more of our friends to know about That Hideous Strength. Okay, so anyway, having said all that.
Thank you all. And just by way of mention, I believe Luke from Lambda Bible Studies will be joining us at some point, kind of like somebody joining St. Anne's at some point. So by way of kind of introductory remarks, the kind of story behind this book is that Lewis and Tolkien had a little challenge towards each other at one point. And they decided that one of them would write a time travel story and one of them would write a science fiction story. And they flipped a coin, and Lewis ended up with the science fiction and Tolkien with the time travel. And if you want more discussion of Tolkien and the time travel, I believe AM, one of the episodes you've done on Tolkien mentions it, so people can go to there. AM, do you want to just mention which one it is?
Well, regarding time travel in particular, I had Fulton Brown on recently, who went into that particular aspect. We've covered it briefly on the episode you were on regarding mythology of England. But when it comes to actually situating the sort of Numenorian time travel mechanics, that's coming a little bit later. So we've got a couple of months before I'll really go into and pursue that angle more in depth. But for now, there are little hints dotted across my channel.
Excellent. And just before we keep going, Luke, welcome to the channel.
Hey,
Good
thank
to
you very
see you.
much. Sorry, I'm a little late.
Oh, no worries, no worries. Just before we get into things, we've been asking everybody what their kind of engagement with Lewis has been before That Hideous Strength. So
yes.
what's your kind of background with Lewis?
Well, of course, the whole Narnia series I read as a teenager. So that was probably all I thought Lewis was for quite a long time. I've since become a bit more familiar with him as a non-fiction Christian writer. This book I read just for the stream, so it's quite new to me, and I'm very glad I did, because I have to say I think it's better than the Narnia stuff. So there we go.
Ooh.
Maybe that's a dangerous opinion.
Tasty.
But we've all been looking in the wrong C.S. Lewis universe all this time.
I was going to say, wait till the end when I drop a mention of Till We Have Faces, which takes it up to yet another level. But anyway,
all right.
So Tolkien took the time travel story, and Lewis developed a space trilogy. And the first one was Out of the Silent Planet, followed by I can never say it, Paralendra, and then this one, That Hideous Strength, comes about in 1945. And whereas the other two are set in space on other planets, this one's set on Earth and stands alone as its own story. You can read it without having read the other two, and it makes sense. And Lewis, in the preface, discusses how this narrative it's a narrative version of The Abolition of Man, which he had written as well. And it makes many of the same points as The Abolition of Man. I think what particularly drew me to this book was two things in particular. One is that many dystopian novels focus on the state of being under a totalitarian regime or a dystopian nightmare. This book is quite unique, I think, in terms of showing us how such a nightmare can come into being, or what things might happen to bring that about.
Right, that's a good point. That's a good point. 1984, Brave New World, you're just in it.
Right.
Like the dystopia is just there, and they don't spend much time, or almost no time really, in explaining how the world became like this. Whereas Lewis is showing you here it's going in that direction. You're not in it yet, but here's how it arises. Yeah, very good point, Nathan.
I think the more interesting thing also to add to that is that this is very much informed by Lewis's own interpretation of current events. So he's writing this in the final years of World War II. There are continued references to using the full resources of the state, which have been mobilized for war, in service of these experiments to transform, human life as we know it. But in particular, he picks up on, the early work of Julian Huxley, who of course later becomes one of the most influential people behind UNESCO. In particular, I believe it's the 1943 Roman lecture he gives at the University of Oxford, which again very much informs what would later become Julian Huxley's very advanced views on transhumanism, which of course is a major theme running through. So this is not just a dystopia, but this is sort of taking place with some sort of existing historical backdrop.
Yeah, got to jump on the Julian Huxley thing because it is relevant to what we're going to be talking about. There is an address, I think, AM, that like his first address to UNESCO or something, or his founding address or something like that. And I was sort of stunned because it's post World War II. It's just a little bit after, and I'd always had this idea, and I don't know where I got it. I'd like so many ideas. It's like it's in the air, but you can't pinpoint who said it. I got this idea that because of the Nazis in World War II, we knew that eugenics was terrible and everyone had sworn that off. Well, here's Julian Huxley in 1946 or something like that, giving the speech about eugenics. And I'm like, well, there you go. I guess it wasn't such a taboo in the wake of World War II. Yeah, comments I have?
It's interesting as well how he said it was a novelization of The Abolition of Man, which starts off with a book which he has received, so supposedly an English grammar textbook, but he points out that what it kind of really does is break down the concept of there being objective values through education. I think he refers to it as the Green Book in the first speech from The Abolition of Man as well. So it's kind of like the rest of The Abolition of Man kind of extrapolates on that theoretically what would happen. Yeah.
I think we can tie this in with so Academic Agent often makes this point that 1984 is not about Nazi Germany, but about post-war Britain. And C.S. Lewis's That Hideous Strength makes that very explicit, that this is what these writers are talking about. You can't miss it in this book, whereas you might in 1984.
Wow, well, that makes it really parallel to Hayek's The Road to Serfdom, written around the same time. It was written before the war was over, if I remember correctly. 1944. And he also, the point of that book was not to be like an anti-communist book, like a Cold War anti-Soviet Union kind of book. It was about trends he was seeing as an expat Austrian who had been in England and had kind of fallen in love with it. He loved the English people and the English culture, but he was seeing the same things that Lewis was seeing, etc. Yeah.
So that's really like, you have to unlearn what we've learned about the kind of last 80 years to try and understand these things. I guess the other thing which really drew me to it is, whereas maybe a lot of dystopian fiction focuses on the evil guys just want power, and that's why they dominate in many ways. In That Hideous Strength, Lewis goes into the various ideologies which might drive a dystopian future, and in so doing is able to touch on the little things in our own lives which help to sustain evil or even bring about evil. He's able to expand it. It's not just political, it can deal with the spiritual, but even the mundane things, such as our relationships with our friends, which friends we choose, and also how we relate to between men and women. These things he can address in this book, which I've never come across at that level, that expansiveness.
Absolutely. I think what I found so profound about rereading this book and really appreciating it for the first time was that this is a book with wonderful characterization. You can say sublime characterization. Often when you have a dystopian novel, the backdrop is the story. It is the world informing the characters that almost becomes the book. But in That Hideous Strength, you can almost say this is a sort of incoming dystopian backdrop to what is ultimately a story about a marriage sort of being coming back together. The spiritual sort of transformation which affects Jane Stoddard, and of course that becoming disillusioned with the progressive element for Mark Stoddard. But then you also have all these various other characters, such as you have the mad genius Philostrato, you have the dithering sort of unassuming deputy director of NICE, who's ultimately one of the most vicious characters in the whole book, Withers. You have the crazed sort of heretical Christian Strake. You have the unassuming but ultimately very moralistic Dimble. You can see in many of these characters real people with, again, all walks of life that would inform that sort of setting. And yet these characterizations all seem very fleshed out, genuine, and it enhances the whole story beyond just being a dystopian novel.
I wanted to build on what you were saying, Nathan, and I guess it's time to drop my reference to the Inner Ring. So
go for it.
I'm sure we could play this ad infinitum, pointing to other things that Lewis wrote that end up where he ends up expressing stuff in That Hideous Strength, where you can see him sort of flesh it out in a nonfiction way in other places, right? Like you could think of the Four Loves when you talked about that the book, the novel touches on friendship, eros or romantic love, etc. Right? You could look at the Four Loves, right? But the Inner Ring, I think, is like Abolition of Man, is really close to the bone on what he touches on in That Hideous Strength, because in the Inner Ring, an essay by Lewis, he describes the dynamic of longing to be on the inside, with the cool people, and then you get inside with the cool people, and then you realize, within the cool people, there's a sort of an inner ring inside the cool people of the really, the ones that really are on top, and everybody kind of looks to them. I don't want to be on the outer part of the inside. I want to be on the inner part of the inside, right? So he describes that whole dynamic, and he, I think, treats it pretty sociologically, not necessarily as something that is evil, but just sort of an aspect of human nature. And he talks about how it can be a good thing. We ought to be on the inner ring of our marriage, right? We ought to be on the inside of that. But he also, of course, lays great emphasis on what you see in the book with the character Mark, which is that desire can be twisted into doing things, causing you to do things that are not good, because the payoff will be that you get to be on the inside if you just compromise this or that, right? And so he's describing a dynamic where those compromises build up until you find yourself just outright doing terrible things because you're within this inner circle, and they're all patting you on the back for doing these things. So anyway, that dynamic in the book that he fleshes out with Mark and the NICE is spelled out in the essay, The Inner Ring. I strongly recommend you read it. After my daughter read That Hideous Strength, who's in the chat, by the way, Madeline, after she read the book, the novel, I asked her to read The Inner Ring. And I said, you will never forget this dynamic. Once you read it, you'll never unsee it. And she said, sure enough, she said, Dad, I see it all around me now. The Inner Ring dynamic.
It's everywhere, and I guess especially with something like cancel culture today, it's extremely high for many people to be thrown out. Lewis explicitly uses the term inner ring throughout the book, and also circle.
Oh, I forgot that. Right? Yeah.
So Mark actually thinks about being in the inner ring of NICE, which probably leads us to a good point of just talking about the kind of structure of the book and what it's fundamentally about, which is that NICE, which is this institute for, let me see, I've written it down, the acronym.
Coordinated Experiments.
That's right. National Institute for Coordinated Experiments. Thanks, Amy. Which is not to be confused with an NHS institute, which is also called NICE today, which I find rather worrying.
This is the mole, right? This is where we have the mole who said, "Hey guys, I know a great name," and he doesn't point out that NICE is a reference to Lewis. Anyway, I like to believe things like that.
So NICE are an institute which are promising kind of development of the United Kingdom through scientific exploration and work, and they approach Bracton College in Edgestowe to buy part of their land. And this sale goes through, and the story shows how Nice are attempting to really dominate the United Kingdom for various nefarious means. And it follows both Mark Studdock, who's an academic at Bracton College who gets invited to be a member of Nice, and his wife Jane, who is having various dreams which are troubling her, and she ends up kind of joining the resistance against Nice. This all reaches a dramatic climax where there's supernatural beings that get involved in various ways, and the magician Merlin returns, and through him, Nice is cast down. And what I wanted to do before we'll kind of flesh out each part of the story, as it were, through more close analysis. Before I wanted to kind of read a couple of passages to do with the philosophy of Nice, because I think that really helps to kind of set the scene. And there's one of the things, it's really helpful that Radlib mentioned the inner circle or inner ring, because there's the kind of philosophy that the minions have about what Nice is about, and then there's the philosophy that the higher ups have, and there's subtle differences between them. So first I'll kind of just I'm going to read two passages which refer to kind of lower down people who think they're in the inside but not really, and then we'll discuss that and then move to the higher ups. So this little passage here comes from Lord Feverstone, who is trying to convince Mark of the benefits of Nice, as it were. And this is what he thinks Nice is about. Quite simple and obvious things at first. Sterilization of the unfit, liquidation of backward races, selective breeding, then real education, including prenatal education. By real education, I mean one that makes the patient what it wants infallibly, whatever he or his parents try to do about it. Of course, it'll have to be mainly psychological at first, but we'll get on to biochemical conditioning in the end, and direct manipulation of the brain. A new type of man. And it's people like you who've got to begin to make him. Does anybody have any initial reactions or comments on that passage?
Oh, it's just amazing. Well, real quick, one connection that comes to mind is the new type of man. This is not new. The idea of the new type of man, right? I think we're seeing bits of it now with transhumanism and so forth in our current day. Lewis obviously was seeing things like that then, but you read the what Marx called the utopian socialists, and you see a lot of this sort of thing. You know, in this communist future, each man will be a Goethe, and I'm forgetting the passage, you know, and he names off all, you know, a Goethe, a Beethoven, you know, he'll compose a symphony in the morning and then work out in the field in the evening, or I guess it'd be the other way around, you know, so on and so forth. But the idea of the new man or the new socialist man had been floating around for hundreds of years by this time, by the time of the mid 20th century.
It's a wonderful piece of writing because it manages to both sound very plausibly like something somebody would really think was a good idea, but simultaneously kind of sets the hairs crawling on the back of your neck with quite how hideous it actually is what he's saying. Very much the slow creep of invasive technology trying to do it for your benefit, but actually kind of crushing you. And well, what was it? You know, education that acts against the will of either the child or the child's parents. You know, this is the vision of somebody who thinks they absolutely understand everything, and that their total control over every aspect of life can only be possibly used for good.
Well, maybe just for playing devil's advocate, why is that bad? If the state is that which got, you know, with science, the true science can lead us forward. You know, it can train children to think the right way. So why is this bad, Luke?
Statecraft as soulcraft. I don't know if you've ever heard that phrase before.
No,
that's an old phrase. Yeah, I'm forgetting the figure that I heard it from. But AM, you were going to say something.
No, I was just going to point out that this is probably, of all the possible futures, obviously this presages even more depressing things, even more horrific things as we get closer into that inner circle, not just of higher ups, but in terms of revelation. But in a way, it sort of reminds me of Aldous Huxley's dystopia, where essentially we talk about in particular prenatal education, psychological conditioning, completely ripping the association of motherhood from the individual human hatcheries, etc. All of this sort of exists in Aldous Huxley. But what is so sort of disturbing about their hideous strength is that is probably the ideal form of dystopia, rather than the thing which is progressively revealed throughout the course of the later revelations.
And of course, the reason that any scientist, any actual practicing scientist who really is a scientist will tell you that they don't work in an environment where they expect to find absolute truths, and that they're mostly struck by the infinitesimal amount of knowledge that they have compared to what they wish they knew. So to genuinely claim to be acting according to science would be to be extremely humble. However, as we've observed in real life, and as happens in the book, the people claiming to be acting upon science appear to have the sort of source code for the universe at their disposal in their own minds, and they think they can hack their way to certainty.
Right, and Lewis and Hayek made a distinction between sort of proper science, right, which I'm sure they viewed, I certainly view it as one of the children of the Christian Middle Ages, right, a child of Christendom, science, right? I mean, the early scientists were literally monks and stuff, right? So they would never denounce science altogether and say, well, we shouldn't do science. Let's sort of pull an Uncle Ted maneuver on science. They were never going to do that, right? Because they saw it as a proper part of our society. So they came up with another term to refer to this phenomenon we're talking about, the trust the science. And they use the term scientism, right? And that is not science itself, but a sort of pseudo-religion built around an idea of science or something like that. So it's been quite interesting in the last 2 years to watch real scientists like Robert Malone, for example, go up against scientism. And I'm hearing these scientists saying all this stuff, and then from the mainstream press, they're telling me, trust the science. And I'm like, well, is trusting the science the same as trusting the actual scientists? Because it seems like they're telling me two different stories at this point.
I'm wondering where Fauci and what's his name, Klaus Schwab, consult with Alcazan's head. I wonder where the secret location is.
Exactly.
They read this book as a tragedy, sort of, learn lessons here.
Just for the record, this channel fully endorses Dr. Fauci and Klaus Schwab. Just for the record, everybody. Yeah, we trust them very much. Amy, you were going to say something.
Oh, sorry, go.
In the final speech from the Abolition of Man, he writes about the man thinking that he by sort of conquering nature, he's going to be able to reshape man, but in reality all he's going to really be able to do is once there is no objective truths left, he will just be guided by his impulses, and ultimately man wanted to be in control of nature will be in control of man just through the impulses, and there'll be nothing left other than the sort of animal sort of impulses and desires.
Well, the interesting thing is, if I can build on that, Amy, I think it's Frost who talks about this in particular. When he's sort of engaging with Mark towards the later stages of the book, he's talking about objectivity. and he's talking about freeing the body from all sort of organic impulses and any sort of morality, any construction. So the idea, for example, of human efficiency and all these things that Featherstone was alluding to earlier, education, whatever, this is just pseudo-scientific. In reality, we need to move beyond all of these human considerations, and we need to not only move beyond these ethical considerations, but we need to move beyond these biological restrictions on ourselves as well, becoming pure mind, essentially, almost non-corporeal, in order to achieve this this form of transhumanism. And of course, objectivity in this case relies on freeing oneself from these sort of the emotions, which are all the results of sort of, again, chemical forces, essentially. So utterly sort of freeing oneself from any sort of biological constraints.
He has that sort of vision, though, but he's not able to really see that's not possible, and his blindness is kind of every time he comes into the book, it mentions how his glasses are reflected over, and he just doesn't, he's completely blinded by his beliefs of what he wants, that he doesn't realize that it's not going to happen. The biological sort of at the head at the end, when they go into the head, and it's just they thought it was science. They thought that they were progressing, but it wasn't anything to do with what they were doing. It was just what the microbes were sort of channeling downwards through them. Yeah.
One of the lovely devices throughout the book is that you see similar conversations happening in both places. So you'll see, for example, on the subject of how should we think about nature, you get a conversation with Jane where she's being told how the mice are the sort of natural housekeepers. We should never have driven them out. We should embrace them. It's great. Look at the mouse. And then like very soon afterwards, you have the conversation happening with Mark, and he's being told that we should drive out all organic life. And as I.M. was alluding to, that really the organic life has done its work because it's produced the mind, and we now need to slowly make our brains live with less and less bodies and reproduce without copulation. And you could see the kind of plan ahead being plotted there.
If I may, I would like to read the second passage that I planned, because it's exactly on this point, Luke. So this is Philostrato, and he's talking to Mark before he's about to meet the head, and we'll discuss what the head is in a second. The head has many sources of information. I speak that you may know what can be done, what shall be done here. This institute, Dio mio, it is for something better than housing and vaccinations and curing the people of cancer. It is for the conquest of death, or for the conquest of organic life, if you prefer. They are the same thing. It is to bring about, out of that cocoon of organic life which sheltered the babyhood of the mind, the new man, the man who will not die, the artificial man, free from nature.
I've been wanting to drop this, and I think this is the right time, because I if I was on the page, it might even be very near there. But anyway, Lewis actually uses the term technocracy in this book. I was sort of stunned by that. Literally the term technocracy. And in outlining their vision for the future, they say the human race is to become all technocracy.
Mm-hmm.
Right? That's how he sums up what you just said.
Yes, it's quite interesting. He makes several predictions. So, for example, the First World Wars are part of this grand strategy of whittling down surplus human beings, essentially. And he then draws the analogy with Stalingrad. Stalingrad, of course, wasn't a great catastrophe because you were just killing off Bavarian farmers. You weren't killing off the head. You weren't killing off the greater technocracy. I think at one point there's this allusion to we have 16 wars planned in the future for the further elimination of this human dead weight. So yes, there is just going to be a collection of technocrats, and everyone else is going to be either sort of subordinated or destroyed in this new baptism of technocratic fire.
But by the way, this is a theme I've been following since I was a teenager, and I first stopped reading the mainstream press and decided to start reading people who are how do I put it, wear their ideology on their sleeve, as opposed to people who pretend to objectivity. So one of the things I did is I read a magazine called The Humanist, because not because I agreed with them, but because at least they were upfront about what they were on about, and they said, okay, we're doing good on abortion. Now it's time to move on to euthanasia and infanticide. I mean, I'm reading this in the 80s, right? They're laying out their plans, Everybody's actually quite honest if you just know where to look, I've noticed. But anyway, one of the things I ran into was the group Zero Population Growth. I don't know if anyone would have heard of this. I don't know if they've continued to be an influential force or anything, but at the time, they seemed to be influencing the conversation. And so it's been interesting to me that, how do we put it? Overpopulation, humanity is a burden on this planet. All this sort of anti-human theme is something that has been there for quite a long time. And Lewis, in 1943, makes it extremely explicit in his portrayal of the Knights that they want to depopulate. They want to have a lot less humans.
Well, in fact, it's just one human in the end. They want one human the perfect man, who will be just a head, running a machine. The planet will be devoid of organic life because that means death. This man will live forever running this machine. And the head of the Institute is literally a head, which Philostrato believes he's brought back to life. And it's this horrible thing which, it's pumping air into it, and saliva's coming out the side. It's disgusting. But this is supposed to be the first step of progress towards the true new man, and they'll keep developing it until they reach this pinnacle. And this is the progress that they seek.
And it's infused with religiosity. I mean, obviously, the horrific irony for Philostrato is that there's a little guillotine in the corner of that room, and he ends up being the pro tem head after Alcazan. But one point in particular is that I think Strake references the idea that the Son of Man will be our own creation. The ultimate sort of pinnacle of human civilization is the creation of God. We will create a new God that will have dominion over all else. So this is, again, you can say the antithesis, the anti-Christianity. And of course, this is why when we get to the final sort of entry of Mark into the inner circle, he needs to make an explicitly sort of anti-Christian declaration in the form of spitting at the cross, even though still at that point, all the way in, there's a part of Mark which is really quite contemptible, because I think sort of noticing through this point, you notice how he's constantly making these compromises, how he seems so, despite again apparently being an accomplished sociologist, how he seems so blissfully unaware of all of the sort of deeper motivations and religious themes, how, often sort of C.S. Lewis will refer to him, he doesn't have a profound education, he is simply a modern. And so all sort of mythical or sort of transcendental qualities are just stripped away. And so even right at the end, when all of this should be apparent, he still can't understand the necessity, if we're going to reach this idea of pure objectivity, of creating this definitive statement against Christianity by spitting on the cross.
Right. He notes with sort of some surprise, oh yeah, a bunch of these weird paintings they've got in this propaganda room or objective room, like half of them are like religious paintings. I hadn't even really noticed it,
How much self-deception do you think, though, Mark was entertaining? Because I remember there's that, and this also relates back to the inner circle idea. He's asked to bring his wife to Nice, and his reaction is immediately to realize that that's the very last thing that he wants, because if she was there, he'd see what was going on around him through her eyes, and it would not only repel her for various reasons, but it would also repel him. So he somehow has the capacity to understand what's going on at multiple levels, and he's just repressing the Jane bit of his own personality. And I think that might be one of the things that's going on with Mark, that he's kind of he's willfully blinkered himself as he goes into inner and inner circles, like his realm of self of kind of exploring the world shrinks as he stops himself from going beyond the scope that he's allowed to explore.
I think so. I think he's very much he's willfully going along with it because he loves being part of the inner circle. It gives him great joy, and actually when he resists it, the desire to kind of throw his lot in with Nice is almost overpowering. He finds it intolerable to resist to this experience. It's really difficult for him, and this is particularly the case in the last stage, where he's invited into the very highest level of the circle, which Frost and Wither are the two members of, and they're trying to get more initiates. And it turns out that the scientific program or Nice's program, I should say, is not really scientific in its primary aim. It's actually being driven by what they call the macrobes, which are kind of interplanetary beings who are kind of a beyond human intelligence. And they want to kind of come into cooperation with these macrobes. And they use the head. The head is a conduit for discussion with them. And so to join, he has to go through this objectivity training, which involves going into this room where there's all these slight abnormalities or strange contradictions which shouldn't be there. So like a door that's not quite right in its proportions, or a painting which is recognizable like the Last Supper, but there's all these is it insects underneath the table and so on. And you're required to do various disgusting things over time, because the whole process is about training you to recognize that your reactions or your emotions, they're just reactions to these things. They have no objective value in their own right. I guess it's normalizing the absurd. I feel like this is exactly what we're experiencing in our own society in many ways. We see this all around us, that we're being trained to react to various things so often that we lose our sense of how terrible these things actually are. And so in the process, we lose the moral objectivity that's actually there.
Yeah, normalization is the one term for the process. My dad would talk about it from the pulpit. That he could see over the course of his life, things that had once been considered beyond the pale were now starting to become considered just fine. And then they would, of course, start working on normalizing the next thing, right? and on and on and on.
Does anybody have any thoughts about the particularly these macrobes, it turns out by the end of the book, are demonic in character, and so they require blood sacrifices and human sacrifice, and the most preposterous forms of worship, of men stripping down naked and bobbing up and down in this kind of bizarre situation.
Well, first we should mention the term macrobe, because it's kind of weird, right? But it makes a little more sense when you hear when they explain it in the book. The idea is that microbes are below the level of the human. And so just as microbes are below the level of the human, lacking consciousness and so forth, there's a level above the human, which is the macrobe. And the macrobe is as much, has a relation to humans as humans do to microbes, right? So just so that term doesn't lose people.
Well, the fascinating thing about this, Radlib, is again the sort of point I was going to. Obviously, this is going into literal devil worship through scientific methodology to normalize again this whole process through the macrobes. But here, sort of C.S. Lewis again is almost elucidating that they talk about creating a scientific form of history. Up until now, all sort of history has precluded the influence of these microbes and these macrobes. And really what he's actually elucidating is the city of God, the idea that all historical events ultimately relate to God, and in particular, this ultimate struggle between good and evil, because ultimately these macrobes are angelic forces and demonic forces. And in this case, the macrobe at the head of Earth, which it should be mentioned, is in some sort of a planetary quarantine due to be taken over, or disproportionate influence of these malevolent macrobes, is now using Nice again to facilitate this process again to ultimate devil worship.
Right. And by the way, quick connections to this family of authors, right? Madeline L'Engle wrote Swiftly Tilting Planet. I'm sorry, what's the first one? I'm not saying it right. Swiftly Tilting Planet, right? So Madeline Engel writes Swiftly Tilting Planet. They leave Earth, they look back on it, and it's just this darkness, right? And then the first book of this trilogy is called Out of the Silent Planet. So you get this theme over and over again that viewed from the outside, Earth is not normal. Earth is under the dominion of darkness, right? And so it's a science fiction-y way to express the powers and principalities that you see talked about in the scriptures, right? And that Satan is the prince of this world. That in some sense, he has dominion over Earth, and Lewis expresses that, right? Am?
Yes, absolutely. In a wonderfully sort of, again, it's sort of brilliant for the atheist or the secularist, because it invites you into this thoroughly Christian understanding whilst prefacing it with scientific gobbledygook. So I very much appreciate it.
Well, and Lewis makes this point that actually this sort of position that they take of pure objectivity, whereas maybe scientists of the 19th century were so committed to materialism, they couldn't countenance the existence of supernatural entities or macrobes. These guys have gone so far in their understanding. They've gone beyond objective reality being a thing. So then spiritual realities can exist. Then they can countenance that, whereas a pure materialist couldn't. So they're different in nature. And I think in the character of McPhee, you see somebody who he can't countenance the existence of such beings because of his beliefs, but he's actually a good character.
I don't know where to drop some of these notes and quotes in, so I'll just do this one real quick. From chapter 2, right in those first 50 pages that I struggled with as a young person. The real thing, describing Nice's goal here, the real thing is that this time we're going to get science applied to social problems and backed by the whole force of the state, just as war has been backed by the whole force of the state in the past. One hopes, of course, that it'll find out more than the old freelance science did, but what's certain is that it can do more. I just love that passage because I feel like we've been getting done to for the past couple of years. It's exactly what Lewis was talking about here.
Well, maybe that's a good juncture to discuss some of the methods that Nice used to persuade the public and the relevant powers that their agenda is good, and also to enact their agenda. And I'm going to read a short passage from when Mark is kind of in the early stages of where he's at Nice, and he meets somebody that we've not mentioned yet, but definitely deserves a mention, Miss Hardcastle, who is she's the leader of Nice's security force, or well, they don't like to call it a police force, but it is a police force. And Miss Hardcastle is a rather tough-looking lady who's rather repulsive in many ways, but also quite upfront about her beliefs. And she asks Mark to write a newspaper article rehabilitating Alcazan, whose head is the head of the institute. He had been executed, and so he needs rehabilitation in the public eye. So Mark says, "You mean the radiologist, the man who was guillotined?" The fairy nodded. "He's to be rehabilitated," she said, "gradually. You begin with a quiet little article, not questioning his guilt, but just hinting that, of course, he was a member of their Quisling government, and there was prejudice against him. Then you follow it up in a day or two with an article of quite a different kind. Popular account of the value of his work. You can mug up the facts. Enough for that kind of article in an afternoon. By that time, what on earth is the point of all of this? I'm telling you, Studdock, Alcazan is to be rehabilitated, made into a martyr. But what for? There you go again. You grumble about being given nothing to do, and as soon as I suggest a bit of real work for you, you expect to have the whole plan of campaign told to you before you do it. That's not the way to get on here. The great thing is to do what you're told. You don't seem to realize what we are. We're an army." "Anyway," said Mark, I didn't come here to write newspaper articles. And if I had, I'd want to know a good deal more about the politics of the nice before I went in for that sort of thing. Haven't you been told that it's strictly non-political? I've been told so many things that I don't know whether I'm on my head or on my heels, said Mark. But I don't see how one's going to start a newspaper stunt without being political. Is it left or right papers that are going to print all this rot about Alcazan? Both, honey, both, said Miss Hardcastle. Don't you understand anything? Isn't it absolutely essential to keep a fierce left and a fierce right both on their toes, and each terrified of the other? That's how we get things done. Of course, we're non-political. The real power always is.
I think this sort of informs your idea, almost a little bit of a pushback about this idea of a dystopia into coming, because you mentioned the fact that already the left and the right are fallacious paradigms to create these phantom political struggles. But there's another aspect to it, which is the fact that NICE already has implicit government backing. It already has all the money it needs. It already has Hardcastle, Fairy Hardcastle, in the fact that she basically has her own autonomous police force, independent of all the regular sort of law enforcement units. The fact that you're a member of this organization, NICE, is often cited as being more influential than being a member of the cabinet. In fact, many sort of references to government and even the king, all of these are sort of treated as irrelevances. All the power is sort of vested in the corrupt legates of NICE. So it seems already that they have sort of already achieved ultimate political power. And this is simply the culmination, the working of the final plan to will in this whatever new sort of state of the macrobes, the son of man created from our own genius, which I think is quite interesting. But yes, I think a large part of this also references decline. I mean, when Malinus Ambrosius is woken up, a major sort of factor of the book is getting this mythical being to either be on the side of NICE or on the side of St. Anne's, the organization which, if anything, is the anti-NICE, but it's a bit more complicated than that. And one of the things he basically sets up is, are you the king? When he's referring to Elwyn Ransom as the Pendragon, is like, no, I'm not a king. So who do I serve? Well, if the king has been assailed by evil counsel, then we need to press the support of Neustria and Hibernia and Caledonia, and if not, we'll get support from Byzantium. We'll bring in the emperor. And I think the idea here is
even the Ottomans. He's like, even the heathens might help us.
Yes, well, this is going back to the 6th century. But even in this idea that C.S. Lewis is elucidating is that we're talking about 1,500 years of decline from the time of Malinus Ambrosius to the point where this whole notion of real power structures and kingship have become almost irrelevant, and now it is this phantom power of NICE which executes all the real sort of not just the ideological impetus for moving towards the new regime of the macrobes, but it has all the resources it already needs to achieve its ends.
Yeah, and AM, maybe you can comment from a historical point of view, though I know 20th century isn't exactly your area, but Lewis, in that passage you're talking about, he paints a picture that feels very familiar, right? All the institutions are in alignment globally, and they're against us, right? Now, was Lewis being prophetic, or was he just seeing what the real score was in 1943?
Well, the other sort of organization I'm sort of thinking of as a direct comparison to NICE is probably the Manhattan Project. It involved, various, obviously it wasn't just an American venture. It was an Anglo-American venture dedicated to mass destruction. That, on the sort of scientific angle, you can draw a comparison with. The fact that, as I mentioned, he was listening to Julian Huxley's speech given at Oxford and was able to gain from this all of these transhumanist elements, which then become, a major part of the focus of the book. But of course, what was fascinating about this is that there was no Cold War. There was no mention of a Cold War. In another novel, you could have the facet, say, for example, that this National Institute for what sort of experiments is it? I can't quite remember.
Coordinated experiments.
Coordinated experiments could be used to build weapons of war against the Soviet Union, or be some sort of a facet in that. And there's no reference also to the National Socialists in Germany. All of that is gone. It's almost as if England is representative of the world in this point. In this case, what I find fascinating about this story is that it's prophetic, yet at the same time, England is sort of like a universal conception. It's the center of where everything happens in the world. And I think I'll bring in Tolkien here, because I think this again goes back to the notion of Britain having this mythical significance as Albion, or even going further to this idea of Tol Eressëa. And there's also a repeated sort of message throughout the book that we are sort of servants of Logres, this kingdom which has been far removed from Albion. So there are these mythical elements which are informing the centrality of Nice, and in particular that forest, which was supposed to be the burial place of Merlin, which is why they originally set that. So you have all these mystical elements being brought in, these science fiction elements being brought in, and all these historical elements being brought in as well. But what I love about the book is that none of these things in isolation is directly analogous to what Lewis is trying to say. And that's my roundabout way of trying to say this.
Mrs. Dimble makes a similar comment towards the end. It's an Anne's when she talks about the history of England being like a history of contradictions, and constantly being back and forth throughout British history as being why the rest of the world didn't like us. Yeah.
Well, I think in particular it's wonderfully foreshadowing, because one of the first things ever mentioned in the book, against all this dull sort of academic backdrop, is the fact that Mrs. Dimble just randomly starts talking about the matter of Britain, essentially, and how all of these things sort of inform us. Of course, we think it's just the irrelevant sort of musings of a potty old woman, but as the story progresses, the idea of the matter of Britain becomes essential, and of course, it is part of the ultimate resolution to the story.
It might be worth mentioning here. Luke, were you going to say something?
I'll just make a brief comment, because I do think he describes extremely accurately the effect on the public that the media can have, the newspapers. I particularly enjoy Mark pushes back a little bit and says, well, isn't it going to be obvious if to educated people, if we're trying to fool them, maybe we can catch out the lower class readers. And the response is why, you fool? It's the educated reader who can be gulled. All our difficulties come with the others. When did you meet a workman who believes the papers? He takes it for granted that they're all propaganda and skips the leading articles. He buys the paper for football results and little paragraphs about girls falling out of windows and corpses found in Mayfair flats. He is our problem. We have to recondition him, but the educated public, the people who read the highbrow weeklies, don't need reconditioning. They're all right already. They'll believe everything. Now, it's sort of comforting to hear somebody else articulate what we've observed. On the other hand, I also find it a little bit blackpilling and disconcerting in that it was such a long time ago, and he had such a voice to articulate this problem and made his point so clearly, and yet here we are, and nobody else seems to be aware of this. So,
well, of course, to blackpill you even further, Luke, this is the time where the newspaper was still sort of supreme. The rival to the newspaper was the wireless. This was before the introduction of mass television, and long before the introduction of the internet. So already at this point, with the relative sort of primitive forms of technology, already the entire sort of bourgeoisie collective has been sort of forced into this state of perpetual NPC-dom.
Yes. Yeah, and perhaps that was the solution that was come up with for how to broaden the scope of the brainwashing. Was the newspapers only seem to have penetrated so far down the intellectual ladder.
I'm so glad you brought up that passage, because it's just brilliant, and it describes our reality, which is, I think, becoming, if ever, more apparent. Oh yeah, maybe I'll drop that quote. Where is it? Things becoming harder and sharper. Oh, I put it on Twitter and not in my notes, didn't I? Oh, here we go. I got it. Good is always getting better, and bad is always getting worse. This is from the novel. The possibilities of even apparent neutrality are always diminishing. The whole thing is sorting itself out all the time, coming to a point, getting sharper and harder. And boy, did that, I mean, I don't know, maybe it's just always been this way, but it has felt like what his words there really apply. Like, we talked about mask off moments. I feel like the mask off moments are just coming faster and faster. And that when I was young, I didn't remember it being so blatant, that, some just want to dominate you and they just tell you that they want to, you know what I mean? Like, it's not subtle anymore.
I guess, like, I was thinking, I know this wouldn't be the allegory, of course, but in our own time, you could very much see NICE as something like the CDC or SAGE. And what they publish, the newspapers or the media these days, essentially just publish from what either side and don't challenge that much, certainly in the UK. And the educated reader typically is the one today which will support them. And that meme with the bell curve, and you've got like the gammon on one side and the intellectual on the other, the Merlin type, and then in the middle you've got the midwit. It very much rings true.
Well, I think Ferry mentioned this explicitly because, again, the sort of insufferability of Mark at the beginning is that Mark is interested in pursuing genuine sociology. And I think there are all these subtle references that Lewis, for some reason, throws in against sociology, but that's another point entirely. But regarding, so he believes he's entering upon a serious scientific study here. And what becomes very apparent from his conversation with Ferry, because he's basically been trying to shore up his position and looking for work, but she is wanting him not for his scientific credentials, but for his capacity as a writer. And I think there's a bit of self-awareness from Mark coming through here, where he believes that he hasn't advanced so quickly through the ranks of Bracton on account of his scientific expertise, but on account of his easy style to read. So it is this acknowledgement that it is the ability to persuade rather than the actual verifiability of the science, which is more important.
Oh, that's excellent. Excellent point. Yeah.
Mm-hmm.
And then there's Mrs. Max Ivy, who is she's sort of quite a sort of lower in the lower classes. She's in contrast to Jane. She's Jane's maid at the beginning, and she's extremely content with her status, and she just instinctively knows what's good, and she instinctively knows like where her place is, whereas people like Jane and Mark, who are like constantly grasping for the sort of attempt to be sort of more intellectual, more interesting, the sort of and Jane initially looks at her with disdain.
It's almost like Miss Mags is quite happy, as you say, with her status. She's not trying to reach beyond it. Something I was talking about on Tolkien Day was that evil fundamentally is from a usurpation of something which does not belong to you in some way or another, whether it's status or wealth or power in some way or another. And you see that with Mark, you see that with Jane, you see that with NICE. Essentially, they're trying to take something that isn't theirs to take, ultimately divinity or everlasting life.
I mean, in terms of, pointing to the genius of Lewis's structure, what Amy has been referring to has an exact parallel in Mark towards the end of the book, when NICE pick up this vagrant who they believe is Merlin. And one of the funniest parts I thought of the novel was the fact that Mark is completely unable to converse or understand this man, despite apparently having written a very authoritative academic article on vagrancy.
That sounds about right.
There's one thing I wanted to mention with Mark's writing before we moved on to another topic, which is that as NICE's efforts escalate in Edgestowe and they start taking over the town, they start importing many Welsh and Irish labourers who are rather crude and unruly and essentially disrupting the neighbourhood. They're knocking down beautiful houses and throwing people out of their homes. They then stage a riot in Edgestowe, and they need an article to come out the next day, or a couple of articles to frame the riot as actually being the result of the prejudices of the locals against the incoming migrants, rather than being caused by the laborers themselves.
I have no idea where you're going with this, Nathan, but I disavow.
I disavow Lewis.
It was passionate when they were discussing the assault and murder of a woman behind the train station, and I can't remember what character it was, but essentially just said, well, that's just part and parcel of the way things are going now, isn't it? Which is, we've heard some politicians say that in recent years.
Yeah,
definitely. And so Mark has to write these articles before the riot has even happened. He's writing these articles, kind of framing it for the press that it's this issue of prejudice, and thus Nice must be allowed to take over the security of Edgestowe. So this whole riot is a pretext for more powers for Nice, and it's only a matter of days. That's the thing, Amy. It's not like it's been 50 years of decline. This is like a couple of days this has happened, and suddenly this is normalized as kind of the behavior that happens with mass immigration into Edgestowe, which is a tiny little town. It's
right. This is great fun because my friend Robert Higgs wrote a book called Crisis in Leviathan, which went to great scholarly length to describe how crisis is used to grow the power of the state, right? I don't think he touches on it in that book, but you might have noticed that sometimes the crisis is induced by the state. Not always, by the way, but sometimes it's induced by the state. And then the state offers itself as the solution to the crisis that it created in the first place, right? And here's Lewis in 1943, just spelling that out beautifully. You know.
Well, I've been thinking about the term crisis a little bit. If we think the definition of crisis is a state of happening so pressing that we must give additional powers to those in authority, maybe there is no such thing as a crisis. Is that just a completely manufactured category? Like there are things that need fast response, but I don't think that fast response ever turns out to justify, the impact of handing over extra powers is always worse than the potential impact of the crisis, right?
Okay, do a video, Luke. Call it the myth of the crisis or the myth of the emergency.
I think we need this.
Yeah, I think you're onto something there.
Anyway, sorry, that wasn't exactly on topic for the book.
Oh no,
it's a good point.
But I do love that that little discussion when Mark says, "Well, call me old-fashioned, but I think we need to have the event before we write about it," and then everybody just falls about laughing because he's so naive to it.
Hey, before we skate past it, Nathan, I did want to at some point talk about what happens to Edgestowe, because it awfully reminds me, AM, Nathan, Luke, everybody, Amy, the scouring of the Shire, right?
Yeah,
it's very reminiscent of that. People being driven out of their homes,
which
right?
Trees being felled.
Trees being felled. Yeah.
The indirect influence of a macrobe, in this case, Saruman.
Yeah, right. Oh,
ruffians brought in, and but then they're completely driven out as well, and
that's true.
It's totally obliterated by the end. All of this,
and in both cases, in the scouring of the Shire and what's done to Edgestowe, the point is that this is on a small, relatable scale. What these authors, I think, feared would happen on a large scale, right? They do it with just the Shire. Tolkien does it with just the Shire, which is relatively small, we know, relative all of Middle Earth. Lewis does it with just little Edgestowe, which I think is painted as a village. Didn't he call it a village? Right. So, a small scale community. So on this small level, they're trying to show what they are afraid will happen on a very large scale and not just in one town somewhere. Right.
Right at the beginning, when Jane and Mark go their separate ways, and Mark gets in the new sports car with Feverstone, and he's driving really recklessly, saying, like, just people can get out of my way, and he's driving way too fast. He's nowhere near a good enough driver to be driving as fast as he is. Whereas in comparison, Jane's on the sort of extremely cozy train and going through all the beautiful villages, and she's kind of getting further and further towards St Anne's and towards that sort of state of the sort of ideal, whereas Mark is the sort of motorized transport is kind of like a metaphor for the sort of acceleration of the destruction of the society.
That's probably a good point to move towards St Anne's, which I'm conscious that we've been referencing, but we haven't really got into the meat and bones of what it is, and it really is part of this Jane story. We've been really focusing on Mark's story for the first part of this stream, but Jane is suffering from various dreams, and these dreams seem to match various things happening in reality. Or she'll read the newspaper and she'll see the figure of the face of somebody she saw in her dream the night before, and it turns out it's the head of Nice in due course. But she is counseled at first by the Dimbles, Mother Dimble and Mr. Dimble, who's a professor at the college. But through them, she is introduced to St. Anne's, which is a rather odd little community out in the countryside, with its head being Elwyn Ransom, who is this amazing character who, if you ever wanted a definition of hero worship, what Jane feels when she's in the presence of Ransom is probably Carlyle's definition of hero worship.
Nathan, could I interject? There's a little
Go ahead.
stage which precedes this. Jane, again, like Mark, she had a religious experience, or was religious when she was younger, unlike Mark, but has since become, I think the word C.S. Lewis used for it was aggressively democratic, or something along those lines. Very much an egalitarian, and as a result, there was this resentment built up towards Mark for this. You could say this beginning of a marriage that is already sort of doomed to failure. But in particular, regarding the dreams, she thinks that there is something medically wrong with her. So she visits a psychiatrist. And one thing which really stood out to me, I have no idea what on earth C.S. Lewis was referencing, but her maiden name is Tudor. And apparently this was linking back to the Battle of Worcester in the War of the Three Kingdoms. I'm like, what? Like, where did this come from? Because obviously the mainline Tudors were brought out, were all dead at this point. And so I sort of went into a little rabbit hole. I was looking at the original Tudors from Wales and seeing this other branch which existed at that time all the way down to Worcester. And I'm wondering what sort of law C.S. Lewis was referencing relating to this deep association, this hereditary association that's made explicit in the book between the ancient Tudors of Wales and this ability of being a clairvoyant. I'm not quite sure what he was getting at.
Well, remember, Am, that is it Merlin? Anyway, somebody says that Mark and Jane, they're coming together, and the child that they were supposed to have, and Merlin's angry that Jane has been unwilling to have that child. The child they're supposed to have is some kind of culmination of
Absolutely.
like lines coming together in some royal blood mystical way or something.
Yes, absolutely. And again, the obviously the caveat to that's on the soon to be St. Anne's side. But of course, in addition to his literary credentials, one of the reasons it's not, again, really given that much sort of credence. It doesn't form that much of an important part of the story. But they keep referencing Mark in particular as having come from good eugenic stock. So on the one hand, you have the ancient heredity from the Tudor on the one hand, and the eugenic quality of what their spawn would be, essentially from a scientific point of view, from the Stoddard side. But what's interesting is that the psychiatrist seems to instantly again have knowledge again of this again connection to St. Anne's as again the ultimate sort of alternative history. On the one hand, you have the progressive element, which is privy to this understanding which transcends mere scientism, and on the one hand you have this other group which is again privy to knowledge on the other side. And I find that fascinating, how all of these little people that both Jane and Mark come into contact with both slowly reveal the extent of this major titanic struggle, which is ultimately the resolution of the book, between the positive macrobes and negative macrobes, i.e. between angels and demons, effectively. But it begins when she believes, she needs to be treated for some sort of a medical disorder.
Every decision we make is on one side or the other, I suppose. Go back to your quote, Radlip, on the goods coming gooder and the evils coming, more evil. the sides are drawn, even in the innocuous. There's no neutral, I suppose, is kind of the one of the messages of the book. And
yeah, so oh, go ahead. I just want to bring us back to the St. Anne's community and some of the thoughts around that. Oh, I know. How about I drop in, Nathan, real quick, the references to people in Lewis's life.
That'd be nice. That'd be a good point.
Yeah, because these are two of the characters that are key characters in the St. Anne's community. So there's two characters. I'm sure there's more if I was a deeper C.S. Lewis scholar that I could identify. But there's two characters who, to me, are obvious references to people in Lewis's life. One is Elwyn Ransom, who is a philologist. And if you heard my article for Tolkien Day that I read out, Tolkien was a philologist. And it was very, in fact, central to all his work. If you understand his work well, you realize how key it is. And so Elwyn Ransom is, as far as we can tell, a tribute to Tolkien, who is someone that Lewis admired. And I don't know if everybody's picked up on this, but it's quite obvious if you know your Lewis biography and some other little bits and pieces that Tolkien was key to Lewis becoming a Christian.
Yes.
They actually record, each on each side record certain parts of a key conversation they had about the nature of myth and its relationship to Christianity. And you know this, right?
Yes, absolutely. But I was going to draw an even further comparison to Tolkien. Of course, you bring up a very important point, which is there are biographical aspects to the story.
Yeah.
And the fact that Ransom is the linchpin for the Christian side and the conversion of Jane. Mm-hmm. I think in many ways, again, that mirrors C.S. Lewis's own conversion. One wonderful aspect of the book is starting off in the secular mindset and entering into this religious mindset. I think there was one thing upon encountering first of all, Ransom is this angelic sort of being. He appears to be much younger than he really is, and yet he has, wisdom sort of beyond all sort of comprehension. And she is sort of struck by this at the beginning. And I think there was one quote which stood out to me, where she basically assumed, because she was, secular, atheist, democratic, what have you, that she was able to win all of the arguments up until that point. But being introduced to Ransom, i.e. being introduced C.S. Lewis to Tolkien, suddenly you're introduced to a whole intellectual environment, a whole spiritual way of contextualizing the world, which had been completely anathema to you beforehand, and suddenly your world is completely changed. I think that was almost a complete mirror sort of image of the conversion of C.S. Lewis upon this fateful interaction with Tolkien. But it goes further than that. Because I've already mentioned that this book had a twin which unfortunately was never completed, which are the Notion Club papers. There, of course, exists, I would say, a complete parallel character in the Notion Club papers to Elwyn Ransom, which is Alwyn Arundel Lodum. But rather than traveling across planets, Alwyn travels back in time. And again, there's this element to dreams, but in particular, he travels back to Numenor, and Numenor again is referenced.
Nice.
And Atlantean civilization is referenced quite a lot in this book. And again, the idea is that whilst Elwyn has traveled between planets, Alwyn has traveled across time through his, as a reincarnation of his old self, who was Elfwine, who was going to be the linchpin for this entire connection of the Lord of the Rings to this mythology of England. So this is actually incredibly deep in terms of the complexity of the Tolkien C.S. Lewis lore. So thank you for bringing it up, Brad Lib.
Yes, awesome. So, so Ransom clearly is, he's the main character of the first two novels. He's not the main character of the third, but by the third novel, the transformation that you see him go through in the first two novels has sort of, to some degree, culminated, and he's in I don't know what to call it. He's in a very good place spiritually, I guess it's fair to say. And so Lewis, in this tribute to Tolkien, paints a character who is both interesting and has depth, if you read the first two novels, right, where he's really developed, but also is someone who clearly is an admirable character. So it's a beautiful tribute. But that sounds easy, right? Lewis becomes a Christian. He's world known for his Christianity and everything, and he pays tribute to a Christian who had a big influence on him. This other parallel to a person in his life is, I think, more interesting and almost more moving because it's less obvious. And that is McPhee. And McPhee is a skeptic. I guess you could think of him as being like from the YouTube skeptic community, and you wouldn't be far off, right? He's a skeptic or a new atheist or something like that, right? He is really committed to being rational, to being logical. He feels somewhat of a throwback, as has already been mentioned, to like a 19th century rationalist type or something like that. McPhee is not painted unkindly in the book, even though clearly he is not on the same level as someone like Ransom spiritually, right? But he's not painted unkindly at all. He's part of the St. Anne's community. And Ransom explicitly says something like, you need a skeptic around. I don't know what the term, but there's a line in the book where he says something like, you need a skeptic around. Like, there's a purpose that McPhee serves, Well, this is a lovely, moving tribute to Lewis's tutor, William T. Kirkpatrick, who was someone who had been a Calvinist, but he left Christianity and lost his post. In fact, it seems because of it, because he had been teaching at like a Christian school, and he just took up tutoring, and he tutored C.S. Lewis, and didn't he? I'm sorry, he had taught Lewis's father. He tutored C.S. Lewis, and he tutored. Before he tutored Jack, he tutored his brother, his older brother first, and then he tutored Jack. And this is quite remarkable. Quick discursion on this, because I had learned more. I knew that McPhee was Kirkpatrick, but in preparing for the stream, I learned more than I knew before. For one thing, Kirkpatrick is the model for the professor in The Lion, the Witch, and the Wardrobe, if you remember, who's very logical. And he says, "Bless me, what do they teach them at these schools?"
Yeah.
And he basically lays out the Lord, liar, lunatic argument that Christians would be familiar with from apologetics. Also, as Amy pointed out, thank you, Amy, Professor Kirk from Lion, the Witch, and the Wardrobe is a main character in The Magician's Nephew. And, well, there's a whole angle on that maybe Amy can spell out, which is quite interesting. But back to Kirkpatrick. So who is Kirkpatrick? He was Lewis's tutor from 1914 to 1917, and Lewis always credited him for rigorous logical training, or dialectical training, he called it. And he always paid tribute to him, even, he had died long before this, right? Even as late as that Hideous Strength, he has this formative influence in his mind, and he pays moving tribute to him, even though this man stayed in this sort of ex-Calvinist rationalist mode, right? So the Wikipedia article on Kirkpatrick says, by this time, the Kirkpatrick C.S. Lewis saw, in 1914, had become a stern, ex-Calvinistic rationalist of the old, high and dry 19th century type, with a strong bent toward formal logic, and he sought to transmit this worldview to his pupil. And this is the part that really blew my mind. So we all owe something. Those of us who love Lewis and Tolkien, we all owe something to this man. Part of Kirkpatrick's goal, which he shared with Jack's father, who was paying the fees for this tutoring, was to help start the likely lad on a course that would create a significant scholar of the 20th century. So we've been talking, Academic Agent has been putting emphasis on, there's more that happens consciously and less that is just an accident. Well, C.S. Lewis, it turns out, was no accident. He became this incredible scholar, author, logical thinker, apologist, and so forth. Well, he was molded that way consciously by Kirkpatrick. Maybe not to be a Christian apologist, right? But to be a great scholar. And he succeeded, and we all benefit. It's a wonderful world.
In Surprised by Joy, he describes finding a letter later on that Kirkpatrick wrote to his dad that said, Lewis, that this man needs to be a professor because he's not going to be employed in anything else.
So there's one other character who is inspired by real life that I've just thought of while you were talking, Radley, which is Cecil Dimble is an expert in Arthurian stories and myth, and he is thus sent to locate Merlin with Jane when he arises from his tomb, so that he'll come and support St. Anne's rather than Nice. Well, Charles Williams, who was one of the other members of the Inklings, was a particular expert on Arthurian legend, but also integrated it into his fantasy literature. And this was a big influence on Lewis and Tolkien. So that seems like a natural kind of connection there as well.
I think you got it. Yep, you're
Yeah.
exactly right.
And Williams himself was the center of a rather spiritual movement that formed around him. There was a small community which had a kind of mystical bent. Him and his wife, I believe. So you could very much see that in the Dimbles, that they are at the heart of this community at St. Anne's, following Mal el-Dil, which is God. But what's rather surprising about St. Anne's is that they're not really preparing in much way to combat nice. Like they're doing chores, they're sitting around eating food, they're picking flowers in the garden.
They're not a reactionary vanguard, so to speak.
No, they're they're not molding anybody to be a warrior, and much to McPhee's disconsternation. And this struck me perhaps in two. You could see this in two ways. One is you could see this as a bit like riding the tiger, in terms of, you know, every institution is against us, so we're not going to try and overturn it at this moment. It would be laughable for the Dimbles and McPhee and the Denistons to wage war on Nice at this point through force. So you could see it in that regard, as a kind of hold the line, keep your beliefs in your community, but let's not go out there and challenge. But on the other hand, there's this constant theme of waiting for a message from the angels, or following the angels. And Elwyn Ransom has a direct connection with the angels. He converses with them. He's a prophetic character in that regard. And so there's a thoroughly Christian message in that respect, that if you've got a God who is active in the world, actually maybe the best course is not to think in terms of the vanguard, but actually waiting for a message in that respect. And I would be interested to hear the panel's views on this approach, because it's very counterintuitive. It goes against many of the views on the online right and intellectual right more generally.
Okay, well, this is not unprecedented. Thank you. I have exactly the reference for you. Ready? It's an essay by Albert J. Nock, and it's called Isaiah's Job. And in Isaiah's Job, Albert A. Nock talks about the remnant. Okay? And he uses an analogy from the scriptures about Isaiah, who basically cries out to God, and he's like, hey, I'm all alone here. And God basically tells him, no, you're not. You're not all alone. I know you feel all alone. I hear you, but you're not all alone. And let me just read very briefly from Nock. And he's laid out the story of Isaiah, right? Let's see. In any given society, the remnant are always so largely an unknown quantity. You do not know and will never know more than two things about them. You can be sure of those, dead sure, as our phrase is, but you will never be able to make even a respectable guess at anything else. You do not know and will never know who the remnant are, nor what they are doing or will do. Two things you do know and no more. First, they exist. Second, they will find you. Right? So that is what St. Anne's is, right? It's a remnant, and it's a safe place. That's one of the biggest things that comes home to you in the book, right? St. Anne's is safe. When Jane is away from St. Anne's, the tension rises, right? When she's back at St. Anne's, you can breathe out. It's going to be okay. She's safe at St. Anne's, right? So the remnant, or St. Anne's, is a sort of a home base, a safe place for the remnant, and it's a place that starts to draw people to it, right? Jane, of course, is our key figure here, but others, Merlin being an important one, right, in the book. But you know, by trusting and having hope, rather than just giving up, scattering, right? They stay together in this small way, and therefore there's a place for people to come, right?
Other than Ransom and I think McPhee, they're all there by accident because they've got either nowhere else to go, they've been evicted from their own homes, or with Jane, she was taken there because it was the first place, she said, after she was arrested by Hardcastle.
I think one of the Christian comments that Lewis might be making is not to assess the world from a human standpoint. I mean, that's made quite clear by who is chilling at St. Anne's. It's the very ragtag group of people you would never pick. And as you say, they're also not spending every day practicing military maneuvers. So even what capability they might be able to obtain, they don't have. And that, I think, is very commonly the case. Actually, you see that the perspective, Christian perspective, would be that God often uses people who appear in worldly terms to be weak to accomplish his ends. So yes, there's way more significance in being on the right side and making sure you are correctly oriented, as it were, than that you are you've got the numeric advantage and the technological advantage and so on.
Well, I think, I don't think C.S. Lewis does directly draw the comparison between the attitude of St. Anne's and the revived Merlin. Merlin coming from a earlier age, Merlin coming from a much harsher age, a much less materially secure age. His attitude was just to confront them, to fight them, and as often the assumption is that because of this attitude, this confrontational attitude, going around attacking the heathen, so to speak, that he could have very easily flipped and been a member of the other side because of this natural bellicosity. But I do wonder if there is, again, I'm going to draw the Lord of the Rings in here, there is some sort of illusion, because of course, comparing this to Tolkien's, philosophy on war, obviously he believed that fighting was justified in preserving, the organic way, the true sort of civilization of Aru Luvatar. You continuously see war after war, confrontation after confrontation. But I think what C.S. Lewis is doing is he's almost using Merlin as that example, bringing in a person, I hate to use a Hobbesian term, but almost in the state of total war, bringing him into this almost fait accompli, which Nice has presented. All of the institutions are gone. All the nations are basically dissipating at this point. The monarch is an absentee monarch. All of his legates, all of his bishops are corrupt. And so all we have left to us at this moment is essentially this, I hate to say passive approach because it's not passive, but it is a method which is founded on faith in some sort of revolution, even perhaps the revelation, the apocalypse, what have you. But I think it is C.S. Lewis trying to deal with a situation which is completely different from that which Merlin himself found himself in 1,500 years ago. And that's why he brings Merlin in as that counterpoint.
And I mean, again, the biblical concepts that went into my head were, what if you brought somebody from ancient Israel forwards and showed them Christ being led to the cross, right? They would think, grab your swords and let's win the day in battle.
Yeah, although perhaps Daniel might be the other way if you think about the Old Testament in terms of waiting for God to return and delivering Israel from exile. And I suppose it's worth making a connection with the fact that St. Anne's, Anne, mother of Mary, mother of Christ, and the church is the mother and God is your father. I think that you should have God as your father and the church as your mother was the kind of ancient saying. So there's this very strong connection of this group is the true church, as it were, waiting for their God to return them from exile, and that exile is characterized as being Britain. Britain has exiled the true England, Logres, and it's this small remnant now, whereas Merlin belonged to that in that time, and so perhaps that's why he would have taken a more violent approach to defend it.
But I think what's remarkable is that C.S. Lewis makes a point that even though it may seem despairing, even though Arthur doesn't make any sort of appearance, there are lots of references to the fact that Logres still exists somewhere, even though at a different point and place. Arthur is still alive. He has become one of these sainted creatures. And Ransom is the Pendragon. He is the continuation of this tradition. So even though it may seem that all is lost, there is still this continuation, this tradition which has been passed to this group at St. Anne's, which has been preserved this entire time, which I think is, again, important, this idea of waiting inculcated into this idea that so long as this group survives, so long as this tradition is maintained, so long as, all the rest of the world may fall, but there is one sort of person who hears God's word, that is the only thing that matters.
By the way, our whole discussion here is anticipating my speech at the U.S. event 1 week from today. I'll be giving it on Saturday, if I remember correctly in the schedule. And I think the title is probably going to be "Don't Panic." And I think our whole discussion, you know where I'm going with it.
It's not a crisis.
Very good. Yes.
Yeah.
It might be worth at this point. Sorry, Luke, go ahead.
No, you go. You go.
Well, we've mentioned the idea of Logres a few times in this stream, and there's a particular passage where Dimble, it's after the climax of the defeat of Nice, and we'll come to that in a second. But the group at St. Anne's are victorious, and all these wonderful things are happening. All these animals outside are falling in love. The place is kind of being filled with beautiful sunset light. And they're discussing the true nature of Logres and how it's the real heart of England, what it means to be English. But then in this passage, Dimble describes how this is not something unique to England. Actually, every country has its own, and I'll just read it briefly.
Please, I forgot to. I've had it in my notes, but didn't pull the passage. Excellent.
No problem. You see, McPhee, if one is thinking simply of goodness in the abstract, one soon reaches the fatal idea of something standardized, some common kind of life to which all nations ought to progress. Of course, there are universal rules to which all goodness must conform, but that's only the grammar of virtue. It's not there that the sap is. He doesn't make two blades of grass the same. How much less two saints, two nations, two angels? The whole work of healing Tellus depends on nursing that little spark, on incarnating that ghost, which is still alive in every real people, and different in each. When Logres really dominates Britain, when the goddess Reason, the divine clearness, is really enthroned in France, when the order of heaven is really followed in China, why, then it will be spring. But meantime, our concern is with Logres. And I just think that's a beautiful articulation of just both of the createdness of how creation is a good thing in Christian theology, and how God's creation exalts diversity in its true sense. And that actually what Nice wants to do is conform everything to their program. In much the same way you can see modern day globalization is trying to conform everything to a rather sterile, homogenous Western capitalism, let's say, which is a really bastard version of it. Whereas actually the true character of these countries should be celebrated. So China shouldn't become like the American West or even Logres. It should actually be celebrating its Confucian character, as it were. And that would be the case for all these different cultures. It's a very beautiful image, I think, that he paints.
There was this wonderful sort of particularist, almost Spenglerian notion about the particularness of people, and just bringing in Spengler into this. I think there is, again, I can't remember because I didn't write any notes to my eternal shame, but I will remember one point, which is referencing, I believe, the course of the next 1500 years, this elaboration after Merlin is shot down as for sources of support. He goes further afield. So he points, I believe, at Cathay, which of course was an old name for the Far East for China. And the assumption here is, and I believe Ransom goes and tells him explicitly, that the source of the malady is in the West, and now it has been spread all across the world to a point where all of these places are now becoming less distinguishable. So it is explicitly referenced, this idea of this corrupting force, whatever you call it, beginning in the West and fomenting this idea of globalization, but universal homogenization, and then almost it seems irrelevant that nice is taking place in England because England has lost its particularness, its specialness. It is now simply the vehicle upon which the new sort of world order, the new system of experiments is going to be brought in. So there you are.
Yeah, I love this passage because it squares the circle. In right wing or nationalist circles, there's a lot of emphasis on the particularity, totally understandably. But sometimes it goes a little too far, and it sounds like it's going towards what Mises called polylogism, the idea that we actually have different logics depending on who we are and stuff. And then I'm like, whoa, I think we're, I'm with you on, each nation being able to have its own character and stuff. But that doesn't mean that like we have different logics or that good is different. Ultimate good is different for one place than another. Well, Lewis really nails it here, right? And what a wonderful way he has of putting it. He says that it's the grammar. The universal morality is the grammar, but then that doesn't give you very much, right? It's just a grammar. That doesn't give you the character and the expression and of a particular people's, right? So you can be a good Chinese person and you can be a good English person, and that can feel and look and smell quite different, but both be good, right?
Yes.
So what a beautiful way of dealing with the tension that I think we're all wrestling with right now in this area. And I have a lot more thoughts on this. I have the video. I've got pages and pages of writing about this, and I've been wanting to do it because it's such a critical issue right now. I want to do something on the diversity heresy, and it got me going back to the scriptures and trying to think about the universalism in Christianity. As some of you may know, in right-wing circles, some people are very unhappy with the universal aspect of Christianity, and they blame it for the fix we're in, right? So I went back to the scriptures, and I'm like, okay, well, what is the universality? And you look at all these passages, and it's interesting if you look at them very carefully. What they actually say, they do say that every tongue and nation and tribe and people will acknowledge that Jesus is Lord in the future, right? But notice what I just said. It says that every nation, every tongue, that is, it won't be one big nation speaking Esperanto all over the globe, right? So this gave me great hope, right? Because the plans of the globalists, I can see from the scriptures, are not going to work. They may try and cause a lot of damage, just like the communists tried to establish socialism and killed a lot of people in the process, right? But ultimately, they'll fail. They will not make one global, thing where everybody's speaking the same language, everybody's doing the same thing culturally. It's going to break apart. We can already see it breaking apart around us, right? That kind of globalist vision, unitary vision. It won't work. It's against the nature of man. It's against, as you said, Nathan, it's against what God made, He already did the Babel thing. He's not going to have to do it again, right? That's my view.
Yeah, and this is probably a great point to bring in the how nice is defeated, because it's directly connected to language. Insofar as at St. Anne's, Merlin is imbued with the powers of the angels that serve God, and he is sent to Nice as an interpreter for the tramp, who Nice believe is the real Merlin, but he's not. And so they're having this great banquet and feast. The head of the institute has come down, who really has no idea what the institute's actually about. He thinks it's just standard progress and secularization and whatnot. But anyway, as the speech, he's delivering a keynote speech, after dinner speech. And as it's going on, he's more and more speaking gobbledygook. It's turning into nonsense. And as Wither, who's the deputy director...
Sorry, Nathan, but what's fun if you've been in a sort of like people speaking corporate speak or academics getting the... What's fun is that not everybody realizes it at first. And it takes longer for some than others to realize, oh, wait a second, I don't think he literally isn't making any sense now, right? Like it's sort of a glide. It glides into from what is barely making sense. As one of the Wither thinks, he's like, wow, it says something like he's skating close to the wind or sailing close to the wind. He's almost saying nothing, right? So he's basically close to saying nonsense before this magical effect happens on him. And then it just glides right over to nonsense, but people don't even catch it at first.
Yes, I mean it's wonderful. It's absolutely wonderful, Bradley, because it's not literally go to, let us go down and confound their language that they may not understand one another's speech. It's far more subtle than that. And I think preface the novel is this idea that C.S. Lewis is basing this. I choose an academic setting because it's something I'm most familiar with. So rather than becoming so blatant, it is this idea of corrupting and entering into this nonsense. And as you elucidated, the idea that already academic speech assumes this form of gibberish, but this is just a form of intensification of that. So absolutely, yes.
So at the realization that Jules is making an absolute fool of himself, Wither gets up and silences him and sits him down and begins to speak, but he literally speaks nonsense. It's absolute chaos. And so then others start trying to speak, thinking that to themselves they sound coherent, but to everybody else they sound absolutely absurd. And so this causes panic in the room. And on the language point, it's the destruction of universal language, and kind of return to the celebration of so many different nations and their own languages in like Babel. And the Tower of Babel is where the in a poem by David Lindsay, Scottish Reformation poet, so connected to my research, I can justify it to my funders this stream. Then he calls it that hideous strength, the Tower of Babel. So this happens, and then another event takes place. This is caused by Merlin, and then the animals which the Institute are experimenting on are let loose within the banquet hall. And
by Merlin, I think, right?
By Merlin, yes.
Merlin is letting the animals free that have been tortured, basically.
Yeah. Yes, and this is directly lifted from a fairy story by George MacDonald, the Princess and Curdie, where at the end of it, all these strange creatures go into a banquet hall and harangue the guests and trap them. Though it's not very bloody in that. This is very gory. Everybody's pretty much ripped to shreds, and it's I always think it's a demonstration that Nice tried to eliminate nature or the natural laws, and the natural laws sorted Nice out pretty strongly.
Right. I'm going to have to go in a few minutes, so I think I've said a lot of what I wanted to make sure to get in, but I did want to talk about what you've just raised. The first time I was struck by the use of violence in Lewis was actually in the book preceding this one. I remember very strongly the memory. They're essentially, for some portion of the book, they're basically debating, Ransom on the side of God, right? And then somebody who gets mentioned in this book quite a bit, in fact. They talk about him being murdered, right? And I'm forgetting his name, but he becomes the unman. He becomes fully possessed in the course of their conversations, right? And he's debating sort of on the devil side, and they're both trying to win over the Eve of that world, right? And so, I'm reading this and being, a scholar, intellectual type, I'm like feeling really comfortable, right? Oh, okay, yeah, good point, good. Oh, interesting. Yeah, the back and forth of verbal debate, right? And then it gets near the end of Paralandra, and Ransom realizes basically that he is just going to have to kill this thing. That the conclusion of the debate is actually that he's going to kill him. And I remember the shock that I felt reading that. Not only that this was happening in the novel, but my beloved C.S. Lewis, that this is how he was going to end this debate. He was going to have the good guy kill the bad guy. I was like, what? What are you doing? Well, lest you think that he felt uncomfortable with where he ended Paralandra, we present to you that hideous strength, where it's fair to say he doubled down on what he did in Paralandra. If you found Paralandra a little shocking, well, wait till you read to the ending of that hideous strength. And I have to say, the part you mentioned about finally the macrobes just completely having them become satanic, and they're naked and they're bathed in blood and everything. I mean, it's a scene that would be shocking in a lot of films that we think of as shocking if you actually portrayed that scene. This is C.S. Lewis giving us this, right? And then there's also, what is it? It's almost like a magical atom bomb in Edgestowe or something, right? There's like an earthquake or an explosion or something like that. And that seems to really be the final end of all of this whole nice thing.
It's an almost a Sodom and Gomorrah type.
Yeah, right. It's like God's judgment comes down on this whole thing. Mm-hmm. Yeah, and so I'm not sure I can even justify why Lewis does this in Paralander and that hideous strength, even to this day. But I wanted to bring it out. You know, the role that the violence has in Lewis here. He does not write like a pacifist, shall we say?
Ransom in the Paralandra, when he was contemplating having to fight Western, he was thinking, you know, this is a great spiritual war. It couldn't possibly end with just a fist fight. And he's like, well, but I'm just a person, so is he. So it probably will just have to end with just a fist fight. Jordan
Peterson would understand. He says at the bottom of every interaction between a man and another man is the in the background maybe is the threat that one guy could just punch the other guy, you know.
I do suspect that it's our unique problem as a civilization or as a culture, that we're so removed from violence that we have absolutely zero connection to it in a positive sense. I think it's actually a very deep human thing to have an impulse and delight in physically killing and destroying our enemies. If we truly believe that they're wrong and bad, then it seems like it is the normal and in some ways appropriate human thing to want to destroy them in, you know, physically. And we've kind of been nudged, as it were, throughout our lives away from that natural impulse. And of course, listeners will understand me to be talking about the natural human impulse to act within Minecraft would be the,
of course,
the appropriate context for what I'm saying.
Thank you for the clarification. So there's so much more we could talk about with this novel. We haven't even really broached the gender relationships, but I very firmly committed to 7 o'clock, and I'm very grateful for everybody's time. So I don't want to run over, and perhaps in the future we can have another discussion of maybe this whole series rather than just this one book. But if you haven't read it already, I hope this stream has persuaded you that Hideous Strength is worth reading for so many reasons. It's so relevant in so many ways, and you'll get so much out of it every time you read it. And get through the first 50 pages. Get through the boring academic meetings. You'll love it. Before we go, Radley, do you have anything to shill?
Speaking at the US event this 1 week from today with friends of ours like Prudentialist and Charlemagne and Ryan Turnipseed and many others. So looking forward to that. I think you could even slip into it if you're just hearing about it now. I have a channel called Radical Liberation, where nominally I talk about politics and economics, but hopefully hearing me on this stream, you'll realize that I've got other things underneath, other themes that I'm keeping my eye on. So there's more to it than might meet the eye if you just look at the nominal topics of the channel. Yeah, that's it.
Super. Luke?
Yes, I am running a religious retreat in summer. So at the end of July, if you're available.
Is it at St. Anne's?
It's not technically called St. Anne's, but I could possibly hang up some banners and decorate it as such. So yes, contact me directly on Twitter or Discord if you're interested in joining for that. It should be a wonderful weekend at the end of July.
Thank you. Amy?
No, I don't really have anything to shill, but I do appear on Women's Hour on the Academic Agents channel every Wednesday with Birdie and Daughter of Albion and Poe. So I'll be there.
Excellent. And Apostolic Majesty.
Nothing particular to shill. Just thank you for having me on.
Well, thank you all for coming on, and it's been a real pleasure. For myself, this will be my last video for probably a month and a half or so. I've got various commitments, a couple of lectures that I'm giving in public, so I need to get on with them. But don't feel you can't subscribe to my channel, guys. It's there's lots of content, there's lots of hours of things. There's stuff on Tolkien, Bob Dylan's musical compositions. There's stuff on the Mafia. There's something for everybody. And C.S. Lewis now. So make sure you watch something.
Absolutely.
Anyway.
Everyone subscribe to Nathan Hood now.
Wherever you are, whoever you are, I hope you have a good rest of the day. Thanks for watching.
Bye.